The ballroom of Ashbourne House shimmered like a jeweled wound beneath its chandeliers, brilliant and merciless, casting light upon beauty while exposing every flaw it touched. Silk skirts whispered across the marble floor, their owners moving with the lazy confidence of those who belonged, while laughter floated like perfume, sweet, expensive, and faintly cruel. At the room's edge stood Miss Eleanor Whitcomb, her gloved hands folded with disciplined grace, her posture perfect enough to conceal how acutely she felt the weight of being observed. She wore a gown of dove-gray satin, modest yet impeccably cut, chosen not to dazzle but to survive. Survival, tonight, required invisibility. Yet invisibility had never spared anyone from notice. Eleanor had once been welcomed into rooms like this without effort, her family name spoken easily, her presence assumed. That was before her father's debts were whispered through drawing rooms with more enthusiasm than any compliment, before her dowry dissolved into polite regret, before sympathy curdled into quiet exclusion. Now she was discussed as one might discuss the weather, unfortunate, unavoidable, and faintly tedious. She felt those murmurs brush her shoulders as she stood, smiling when required, silent always. The cruelty of society lay not in open condemnation, but in the gentle way it stepped aside, leaving one alone in full view. Across the ballroom, the Duke of Ravensmere held court without appearing to try. Tall, dark-haired, his expression composed to the point of severity. He wore mourning black despite the passage of years since his wife's death. Power clung to him as naturally as breath. Men deferred, women watched, and even the chandeliers seemed to bow in deference to his presence. He did not smile often, and when he did, it carried the weight of intention. Eleanor had never spoken to him, yet she knew his story as everyone did, his wealth, his influence, his solitude. He was admired at a distance, feared up close, and understood by no one. Least of all, she thought, by himself. A ripple passed through the crowd as a young countess laughed too loudly near Eleanor, her eyes flicking with deliberate casualness. "Such bravery!" she murmured to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice. Eleanor felt the sting, familiar and sharp, but she did not flinch. Dignity, once fractured, must be worn like armor. She straightened, lifting her chin, reminding herself that shame only triumphed when invited. Yet tonight, the effort felt heavier than usual, as though the room itself conspired to press her down. Music swelled, a waltz drawing couples together, and Eleanor watched as partners were claimed with practiced ease. No hand reached for hers. That, too, was expected. She told herself she was content to observe, to endure. Then her gaze drifted, unbidden, toward the Duke. He stood apart from the dancers, a glass of red wine in his hand, listening as a gentleman spoke animatedly at his side. There was something different in his bearing now, a tension beneath the calm, a flicker of distraction that did not belong to him. Eleanor frowned slightly, unsure why unease crept along her spine. As the Duke lifted the glass, light caught the wine, turning it dark and gleaming, and in that instant Eleanor saw it, the faint residue clinging to the rim, an unnatural shimmer that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. Her breath caught. She did not know how she knew, only that certainty struck her with cold precision. This was wrong. Danger, dressed in civility, had found its mark. Around her, conversation flowed, oblivious, while her heart began to pound with sudden, reckless urgency. She should have looked away, should have trusted that such matters belonged to those with power enough to intervene. She was no one now, a woman balanced on the edge of irrelevance. Yet something fierce stirred beneath her restraint, a refusal to watch silently as fate unfolded its cruelty unchecked. The Duke raised the glass higher, preparing to drink, and Eleanor stepped forward before fear could claim her. Each stride across the marble felt like crossing a battlefield, eyes turning, whispers gathering. She felt exposed, incandescent with purpose. She reached him just as the glass touched his lips. The room seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor leaned close, her voice a whisper meant only for him, trembling yet resolute. "Don't drink." Her gloved hand struck the stem, wine spilling like blood across polished stone. Gasps erupted. Silence followed, heavy and unforgiving. The Duke froze, crimson staining his cuff, his gaze locking with hers. In that charged stillness, Eleanor understood she had crossed a line from which there was no graceful retreat, and whatever came next would change everything. After the spill, Sound returned to the ballroom like a shattered mirror pieced together wrongly. Voices overlapped, skirts rustled, and astonishment hardened into judgment. Eleanor felt it descend upon her shoulders with physical force, the collective recoil of a society offended by interruption. She stepped back at once, color draining from her cheeks, already preparing for the familiar retreat into disgrace. Yet the Duke did not move away. He studied the fallen glass, the spreading stain, then lifted his eyes to her face with an intensity that stilled her breath. In that gaze there was no anger, only calculation sharpened by curiosity. A murmur rose as his hand came up, not in reprimand but in quiet command. Conversation faltered. He turned toward Eleanor fully, close enough that she caught the faint scent of leather and winter air. For a suspended moment, the rules of the room wavered. Then, with deliberate calm, he leaned forward and pressed his mouth to hers. It was brief, restrained, unmistakable. The sound it made was softer than a whisper, yet it struck the ballroom like thunder. When he withdrew, the silence had become something else entirely, a charged vacuum where scandal took root. Eleanor scarcely felt the floor beneath her. Shock eclipsed fear, and fear chased after it. She did not pull away because she could not move. The Duke's hand hovered at her elbow, steadying without claiming, as though he alone understood the magnitude of what had been done. He said nothing, offered no explanation, only turned back to the onlookers with a composure that bordered on defiance. "An accident," he remarked evenly, glancing at the wine on the marble. "And a misunderstanding." The words were insufficient, and everyone knew it. Whispers surged with renewed appetite as Eleanor retreated. She felt herself dissolving into rumor before she reached the edge of the room. Some faces burned with envy, others with outrage, and a few with pity sharp enough to wound. She did not look back. If she did, she feared she might break. Outside the ballroom, cool air met her flushed skin, and she paused, bracing one gloved hand against the wall as the enormity of her actions settled in. She had not saved a duke. She had destroyed herself. Yet the night refused to release her so easily. By morning, the city hummed with speculation. Eleanor remained indoors, curtains drawn, listening to the muffled rhythm of carriage wheels passing like judgment. Letters arrived unopened from well-meaning relatives advising prudence and withdrawal. She accepted their concern without reading it, knowing what it would contain. Then, just before dusk, a small parcel was delivered by a footman she did not recognize. No card accompanied it, only the Duke's crest pressed into dark wax. Inside lay a pair of kid gloves, immaculate and unused, the leather soft as a secret. Beneath them, a slim volume of poetry bound in faded blue, its pages marked at a single poem. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she read the lines, words of courage written for those who stood alone against the crowd. The gift was modest, unassailable, and unmistakably intentional. It neither apologized nor retreated. It acknowledged her. In the days that followed, signs accumulated like quiet assurances. A carriage slowed when she crossed the street, its crest familiar. At the opera, a seat beside hers remained conspicuously empty until the Duke arrived moments late, inclining his head in greeting as if they shared an understanding invisible to others. Their exchanges were brief, carefully public, yet charged with something unspoken. He never mentioned the kiss. He never mentioned the wine. Instead, he spoke of weather, of music, of inconsequential things, while his eyes asked questions he did not voice. Society, however, found its voice quickly. Invitations dwindled, then ceased. Eleanor's name became shorthand for impropriety disguised as bravery. She bore it with a calm she did not feel, drawing strength from the small proofs that she had not been dismissed entirely. Still, uncertainty gnawed at her. A kiss could be strategy. Tokens could be courtesy. Power often cloaked its intentions in ambiguity. She could not afford hope without cost. Between those encounters, rumors twisted into sharper shapes. Some claimed she had ensnared him deliberately, others that he had taken a cruel fancy meant to amuse. A pamphlet circulated hinting at political intrigue, at enemies bold enough to poison a duke and bold women reckless enough to intervene. Eleanor heard these echoes through servants and shopkeepers, each repetition sanding away a little more of her peace. Yet alongside the malice came a single, startling defense. At a crowded luncheon, A matron known for precision declared the Duke a man not given to whims, and the room fell quiet. It was not absolution, but it was resistance, and it carried his shadow. One afternoon, a bouquet arrived unannounced. Winter roses and rosemary, symbols of remembrance and fidelity, arranged with austere care. No note accompanied them. Eleanor placed the flowers in water and watched them open, petal by petal, as if time itself were conceding ground. She understood then that whatever the Duke intended, it would not be small, and it would not be safe. She rehearsed refusals in the mirror, each one dissolving under the memory of his steady gaze, until resolve thinned into resolves opposite, a daring patience that asked not for rescue, only for truth, whatever its weight, and its consequences endured. The cost announced itself one evening in the form of a sealed envelope, heavier than it appeared. Inside was an invitation to Ravensmere House, requesting her presence for tea, signed simply with his name. No flourish, no excuse. Eleanor stared at it until the candle burned low. To accept was to confirm every rumor. To refuse was to forfeit whatever fragile alliance had formed. As rain began to tap against the window, she realized the scandal had already claimed her. What remained was choice, and the courage to face what the Duke might say when no witnesses remained. Rain traced slender paths down the tall windows of Ravensmere House, blurring the gardens beyond into a wash of gray and green, as if the world itself wished to remain discreet. Eleanor was shown into the Duke's private library, a room shaped by restraint rather than display. Shelves rose to the ceiling, dark with age, their spines dulled by decades of handling. A fire burned low, offering warmth without comfort. The air smelled faintly of smoke, leather, and something older, patience, perhaps, or solitude. She removed her gloves slowly, aware that every movement felt amplified by silence. The Duke stood near the hearth, his back to her at first, hands clasped behind him. Without the crowd, without the weight of public eyes, he seemed different, not diminished but more sharply defined, like a blade drawn from its sheath. When he turned, his expression was composed, though she sensed an undercurrent she could not yet name. He inclined his head. "Miss Whitcomb, thank you for coming." His voice carried none of the ballroom's command, only courtesy edged with gravity. She answered with a curtsy measured and precise, offering him dignity because she needed to preserve her own. They spoke first of neutral things. The weather, the city's mood, a recent debate in Parliament. Each word landed carefully, like steps across thin ice. Eleanor felt her pulse settle into an anxious rhythm, every breath a negotiation. She could not forget why she was there, nor could she summon the courage to name it outright. It was the Duke who ended the charade. "You saved my life," he said quietly. The statement was not dramatic, merely factual, and its simplicity undid her defenses. "I did not know that I had," she replied after a moment. "I only knew that something was wrong." Her hands tightened around her gloves, twisting the leather. He studied her as if weighing not her answer but the manner of it. "Instinct," he said. "Or courage." She shook her head. "Fear," she corrected softly. "Fear of remaining silent." The confession surprised them both. It hovered between them, fragile and true. He moved closer, not intruding, yet altering the air. "Silence has its uses," he said. "But it exacts a cost." The firelight caught in his eyes, revealing a weariness she had not noticed before. "I have paid it often." Eleanor felt something shift then, a recognition that his power insulated him from many harms but not from loneliness. She dared to meet his gaze. "So have I." The words escaped before she could temper them. Once spoken, they demanded acknowledgment. The Duke gestured toward a chair, and they sat opposite one another, the small table between them a boundary neither crossed. "I kissed you," he said, not unkindly, "because the room required explanation, and because I wished to give you protection." He paused. It would be dishonest to pretend that was the whole of it. Eleanor's breath caught. She waited, heart pressing against her ribs. "You looked at me," he continued, "as no one has looked at me in years. Not with awe, not with ambition, with concern." She lowered her eyes, heat rising to her cheeks. "I did not think of you as a duke in that moment," she admitted. "Only as a man about to be harmed." The simplicity of it seemed to move him more than any praise. His mouth curved, not quite a smile. "That is rarer than you know." Silence followed, weighted but not awkward. In it, Eleanor felt the room breathe, as if the walls themselves leaned in. She found her courage again, though it trembled. "You have placed me in an impossible position," she said, meeting his eyes. "I am grateful, and I am ruined." He did not dispute it. "Society is unforgiving," he replied, "particularly to women who act." His candor steadied her. "I do not regret what I did," she said. "But I will not be used as a gesture, however gallant." The words cost her, yet once spoken, they felt like release. The Duke's expression softened, something guarded loosening. "Nor would I ask you to be," he said. "I invited you here because I owe you truth." He rose, pacing once before the fire, then stopping. "There are those who wish me removed," he said. "Not disgraced. Removed." Eleanor stiffened. "The wine," she whispered. He nodded. "An early warning, perhaps. Or a test." He turned back to her. "Your intervention complicated matters. For them. For me." His gaze held hers steadily. "I do not know yet what I can offer you safely." Eleanor stood as well, the fire's warmth at her back lending resolve. "Then do not offer anything," she said. "Only honesty." He regarded her for a long moment, as though measuring the shape of a future he had not allowed himself to imagine. "Very well," he said at last. "I am drawn to you." The admission was plain, unadorned, and therefore devastating. "But I will not pretend that affection alone can shield you from consequence." He hesitated, then added, "If you choose to step away, I will not think less of you." The choice pressed upon her, heavy and luminous. She felt fear, yes, but beneath it, something steadier, a sense of being seen that outweighed caution. She lifted her chin. "I will not step away," she said quietly. The Duke inhaled, as if bracing himself. Before he could speak, a sharp knock echoed through the room. A servant entered, pale and urgent, carrying a folded paper. "Your Grace," he said, voice low. "There is word from the house. They are preparing an announcement." The Duke took the message, his jaw tightening. Eleanor watched his face change, understanding without explanation that the world beyond the library had begun to move against them. The announcement arrived before dawn, carried by the low toll of bells that marked neither wedding nor death but something colder, obligation. Eleanor read the notice in silence, the words blurring as the meaning sharpened. The Duke of Ravensmere was expected to declare his intention to pursue an alliance deemed suitable to his station, a union discussed in corridors long before ink met paper. It was presented as inevitability, as though his will were a ceremonial detail rather than a force. Eleanor folded the paper with care, her hands steady despite the ache gathering behind her ribs. By evening, Ravensmere House stood lit against the dark like a ship refusing to founder. Carriages lined the drive, their lamps casting restless halos on the gravel. Eleanor arrived alone, her reflection pale in the glass as the doors closed behind her. She was ushered not to the library this time, but to the great hall, where voices gathered in anticipation. Chandeliers burned fiercely overhead, illuminating faces sharpened by curiosity. This was not a private reckoning. This was theater, and every eye was hungry. The Duke stood at the far end, his posture composed, his presence commanding even before he spoke. When he saw Eleanor, something in his expression shifted, a tightening that passed quickly, replaced by resolve. He crossed the distance to her, ignoring the murmurs that followed. "You did not have to come," he said softly. "Nor did you," she replied, meeting his gaze. There was no reproach between them, only shared understanding. He inclined his head, a silent acknowledgment that the hour demanded more than caution. Conversation stilled as he turned to face the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You are here," he began, "because there has been speculation regarding my future." A ripple of approval moved through the crowd. Eleanor felt it brush past her like a tide meant to carry her away. The Duke continued, his tone measured. I will not pretend that my position absolves me of responsibility. But neither will I allow responsibility to be mistaken for surrender. A few brows furrowed. The air thickened. He paused, and in that pause Eleanor felt the weight of every whispered judgment settle upon her. She could still step back. She could still vanish into the margins where survival required nothing but endurance. The Duke's eyes found hers again, steady and intent. There are moments, he said, when choice reveals itself not as privilege, but as duty. He turned then, extending his hand toward her. Gasps followed, sharp and unrestrained. Eleanor did not hesitate. She placed her gloved fingers in his palm, feeling the tremor he did not conceal. "I choose her," he said. 3 words, plain as truth, struck the hall with irrevocable force. Silence fell, stunned and absolute. Eleanor felt the world narrow to the warmth of his hand, the certainty of his stance. He did not elaborate. He did not defend. He had declared, and declaration was enough. Murmurs erupted, anger and disbelief tangling with awe. Somewhere, a woman laughed softly, disbelieving. Somewhere else, a man muttered of consequences. The Duke did not release her. "Miss Whitcomb acted with courage when others would have looked away," he continued, his voice calm despite the storm. "She did so without expectation of reward, and at great personal cost. That, in my estimation, is character." Eleanor's throat tightened. She had not expected this public rendering of her private resolve. It felt like exposure and absolution intertwined. "If that unsettles you," he added, "then I suggest the fault lies not with her." A figure stepped forward, emboldened by indignation. Accusations flew, thinly veiled as concern. The Duke listened without interruption, then raised a hand. "The matter of my safety has been under investigation," he said. "It will conclude shortly." The implication rippled outward, silencing speculation. He did not accuse. He did not explain. Power, wielded sparingly, carried its own authority. Eleanor stood beside him, spine straight, heart racing. She felt eyes upon her, weighing, reassessing. She was no longer merely an object of pity or scandal. She was a presence claimed by choice. Yet beneath the triumph lay fear, sharp and honest. What came after declaration? The Duke seemed to sense it. He leaned closer, his voice for her alone. "Whatever follows," he murmured, "we will face it openly." She nodded, finding steadiness in the promise. The gathering dispersed slowly, conversations fractured and subdued. Some offered stiff congratulations, others avoided Eleanor entirely. She accepted both with equal grace. When the hall finally emptied, leaving echoes and cooling wax, the Duke turned to her, his expression gentler now that the audience was gone. "You have changed my course," he said. "And I yours," she replied. Neither smiled. The future pressed close, uncertain and bright. As they stood together beneath the fading chandeliers, Eleanor realized that resolution did not mean peace, only direction. Beyond the doors waited scrutiny, resistance, and the long memory of society. Yet for the first time, she did not face it alone. The Duke squeezed her hand once, a silent vow. Outside, thunder rolled distantly, promising storms yet to break, and Eleanor felt a quiet certainty settle within her. Whatever was coming would demand everything they had dared to claim. Morning came quietly to Ravensmere, as if the estate itself were holding its breath. Mist lay low over the lawns, softening the sharp lines of stone and hedge, and the windows of the great house reflected a pale, tentative light. Eleanor stood at one of them, hands folded before her, watching the day take shape. The night of declaration already felt distant, like a bell still echoing long after the sound had faded. Yet its consequences pressed close, shaping every thought. She was no longer merely enduring the gaze of society, she was confronting it. The Duke joined her without announcement, his presence now familiar enough to feel earned rather than imposed. He did not speak at once. Together they watched the mist lift, revealing paths that had always been there, though hidden. "They will not relent quickly," he said at last. "Nor should we expect them to." His voice held no bitterness, only realism tempered by resolve. Eleanor turned to him, noting the lines of fatigue softened by something steadier. "Nor should we retreat," she answered. He inclined his head, a gesture of agreement that felt less like command and more like partnership. News traveled swiftly, carried by papers and parlor talk alike. Some accounts praised his courage, others condemned his recklessness, and a few focused entirely on Eleanor, dissecting her worth with ruthless fascination. Invitations returned cautiously, altered by curiosity rather than acceptance. Eleanor attended only what was necessary, choosing presence over appeasement. Each appearance felt like a test, each glance a measure. She learned quickly that dignity was not granted by approval but maintained by consistency. The Duke stood beside her when he could, and when he could not, his absence spoke of trust rather than neglect. Weeks passed, and with them came quiet confirmations. The investigation concluded without spectacle, rumors dissolved into uneasy silence, and certain names vanished from polite conversation altogether. The danger that had once hovered unseen receded, replaced by a subtler challenge: endurance. Eleanor found herself adapting to a role she had never imagined, not as ornament but as counterpart. She listened, learned, and spoke when it mattered. The Duke watched her with a pride he did not attempt to disguise, though he never claimed credit for her strength. One evening, as autumn deepened and the air sharpened, they walked the gardens together, lantern light swaying between them. Leaves fell in deliberate spirals, their colors rich and unrepentant. "Do you regret it?" Eleanor asked suddenly, the question drawn from a place she rarely allowed voice. He stopped, turning to face her fully. "Not for a moment," he said. "I regret only the years spent believing that caution was the same as wisdom." She smiled then, small but genuine, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. Their union was announced without extravagance, marked by restraint rather than spectacle. Some called it defiance, others inevitability. Eleanor found that labels mattered less than the quiet moments that followed. Shared breakfasts, unguarded laughter, disagreements resolved without spectators. The Duke's world did not shrink to accommodate her. It widened, reshaped by inclusion rather than concession. She brought with her a memory of scarcity that sharpened generosity, a vigilance against complacency that kept comfort honest. On the morning of their wedding, rain threatened but did not fall. The chapel filled slowly, the air thick with expectation tempered by curiosity. Eleanor walked forward with measured steps, her gown simple, her bearing unyielding. She did not look for approval. She looked for him. When their eyes met, the noise receded, replaced by the steady certainty that had carried them this far. The vows were spoken plainly, each word chosen for its weight rather than flourish. When he took her hand, it was with reverence earned through trial. Life after did not unfold as a fairy tale, but as something sturdier. There were negotiations, compromises, moments of doubt met with conversation rather than silence. Eleanor learned the art of influence wielded quietly, the power of listening before speaking. The Duke learned to share burdens once carried alone. Together, they faced a society that adjusted reluctantly, its memory long but not immutable. Scandal softened into story, story into legend, and legend into precedent. Years later, a young woman would stand at the edge of another ballroom, watching the dance with wary eyes, and Eleanor would notice her. She would remember what it was to be unseen, to be weighed and found wanting by measures that meant nothing. She would cross the room without fanfare, offering kindness without spectacle, altering a path in ways no one would record. Legacy, she had learned, was not built solely through grand declarations, but through the quiet insistence on humanity. On an evening much like the first, chandeliers glinting and music swelling, Eleanor and the Duke stood together, observing rather than performing. He leaned close, his voice a familiar warmth. "Do you remember the wine?" he asked softly. She did, always. She remembered the fear, the courage, the moment when silence broke. "I remember the choice," she replied. He smiled then, not for the room, but for her. Outside, night gathered gently, and within it, their story endured, not as scandal, but as testament.